Either you uphold the principle or you don't uphold the principle. If you don't uphold the principle, I'm going to call you out for not upholding the principle. On his epitaph, we'll read 45th and 47th presidents of the United States. He said a lot of shit.
Sanctuary jurisdictions have lower crime rates. You move to a state that has higher insurance rate, higher car insurance, not just home insurance, has higher property taxes, many of these red states.
And I think that we should start from a position in the United States of gratitude and recognition that we live in a free country where the vast majority of decisions are your own.
This is Gavin Newsom.
And this is Ben Shapiro.
All right, Ben Shapiro, welcome.
Hey, thanks for having me.
I love it. All the way from Florida. We'll get to that in a moment.
Hey, you seem a little bit spicy about it.
Yeah,
a little salty.
Well, Texas, that would have been more spicy. But especially, come on, you're a Hollywood kid, at least Hollywood adjacent. You're a Burbank kid.
Born and bred born in St. Joe's in Burbank.
I love that.
And
what year? 1984.
Mm-hmm.
And you went. And it's interesting because you were sort of middle class family. Grew up, and I got a new book we're going to get to in a moment, Lions and Scavengers. But in that, you talk about your home, where I think 6 members of your family living in a 2-bedroom home, 1 bathroom, Burbank, California, and you describe it, at least briefly, as pretty bucolic. Huh?
Yeah, it was great. It was great. I mean, Burbank was a great place to grow up. It was like kids playing in the street, and I had the greatest privilege of all, right? I'm an American growing up in the greatest country in the history of the world, and I've got a 2-parent household. My parents love each other, and they take care of us, and they're able to make a middle-class income. My mom started off as a secretary and worked her way up to become vice president of a small film and TV company. My dad came out here to be a composer, and he ended up playing piano at a restaurant on Ventura Boulevard, I believe. It was in... it was in across from Universal Studios. It was the Michelli's over there.
And he was, like a 5-night-a-week piano guy there?
A couple nights a week. He'd go in there and play jazz piano because he'd been playing since he was 14. And and so that's how I grew up. And again, I think that's the American dream is you start there and then you end up making a better life for your kids and they end up making a better life for themselves. And that upward trajectory is kind of what America's all about.
I love it. How many brothers and sisters?
So I have 3 younger sisters.
3 younger sisters.
3 younger sisters.
And were they music? Because you were a violinist, child,
right? Yeah, I started playing violin when I was 5, and then I was pretty good. I mean,
It was your dad just saying, "You're going, son, you will be." I mean, they threw that at you and they made you, and you're crying. Doing
no,
these
it
lessons,
definitely wasn't that.
You loved it.
No, I was pretty dedicated to it for sure. I was practicing by the time I was 16, maybe 3 hours a day or something. And then I looked at sort of the life of a musician and I thought, well, again, that upward trajectory is very difficult, particularly in classical music. And so I thought, maybe I better shift career strategies here. But when I went to UCLA, I went to UCLA for undergrad. When I went to UCLA, I was 16 at the time. My parents didn't want me going out of state for school, so I was living at home because I was 16.
Wow.
And I thought I was going to double major in biology and in music, actually. And I got on campus and I found myself kind of drawn to politics, and the rest is.
I want to get back to that a little bit more. How about your sisters? Where did they end up in terms of their professional pursuits and careers?
So all of us grew up obviously here. Only one is still here. I still have one sister who lives in Orange County. I have a couple of sisters who live within a mile and a half of me in Florida. So basically the whole family ended up in Florida. My parents ended up near me in Florida. My in-laws who lived in Sacramento ended up near me in Florida. And there may be some reasons for that, Governor.
We'll get to that. We're going to get to all of that and a lot more. I just want to paint the picture a little bit because
I appreciate it.
Not everybody knows your childhood, but it also connected. I mean, as you said, UCLA undergrad, and then your interest.
My wife went to UCLA Medical School. I mean, we're very California embedded.
I love that. And but politics had its calling there. Would you remember sort of a moment or issues, or was politics part of your childhood? Was it part of the conversation around the dinner table? Were your parents politically active, engaged?
They weren't super politically active. I would say they were kind of Reagan Republicans. And growing up, we would talk politics in the house. But the thing that sort of sent me in a political direction overtly is I got to college campus at UCLA, and I picked up a copy of the UCLA Daily Bruin. And this is back in the year 2000. There was an editorial from the Bruin editorial board, I believe, comparing Ariel Sharon, then the prime minister of Israel, this would have been 2001, I guess, to Adolf Eichmann, the Nazi. And so I walked in and I said, I'd like to write a counter to that. And that turned into a point-counterpoint column that I would write every week. That became pretty popular. It turned into kind of a normal column. And then I went to my father one day and I said, do you think that my stuff is good enough to be published in like a normal paper? And he said, might be. Let me do some research. So he found this place called Creator Syndicate, again, out of California. and they syndicate a bunch of columns to different newspapers around the country. At the time, it was everybody from Molly Ivins on the left to David Limbaugh on the right. And so I applied cold, and they called me 3 weeks later. I was 17, and they said, we'd love you to write a syndicated column. So pretty much all of my bad ideas since I was 17 have been public, which is, an interesting way to live for sure.
So at 17, I mean, that's pretty remarkable, that young age. You have a syndicated national column, and a few years later, 20, you have published, what, 2 books by then?
So you're right. My first book came out when I was 20 it was sort of an expose of leftism on college campuses. I think some might say it was a little ahead of its time. And then I went to Harvard Law School at 20, and I wrote a couple of more books while I was at Harvard Law. And when I came out, I came back to LA, and I practiced at a real estate firm or real estate wing of a major law firm called Goodwin Proctor.
Right.
I practiced there. I lasted for about 10 months, decided I hate it, quit. I remember walking into the boss's office and saying, I hate it here and I want to leave. And I remember him turning to me and saying, you're never going to make as much money as you're making right now.
Gosh, yeah.
And I've been wanting to send him some tax returns for a few years now. But, it all worked out. Politics was something that I was always very invested in. And so my sort of political approach generally is that I'm much more invested in principles than personalities. I care much more about the ideas than I do about sort of the gossip aspect of politics.
Right.
I think that's unfortunately becoming less common.
Right.
I think that, it's great that you're having me on. I really appreciate that. I like the exchange of ideas. I've always liked the exchange of ideas. Yeah. And so that's still, I hope, what animates me, what animates the show.
Love that. You're obviously known as, people have described you in so many different ways, but debate bro. This sort of quick wits. Obviously next level intellect, ability to quickly distill facts and figures. You talk about facts over emotion, et cetera. But were you that person in high school? Were you that person in middle school? Or did that take shape?
I was pretty combative in high
UCLA?
school, I would say. I'd skipped a couple of grades. So I skipped 3rd and I skipped 9th.
Wow.
And so I was much younger and much shorter and much skinnier and much more of a wise ass probably than some of the other kids in my high school class. And so high school was not exactly a joy for that reason.
Right.
But I've said before that obviously bullying is terrible, but being bullied can be sort of a make or break situation for you, meaning that a lot of the people that I know who are very successful went through a lot of adversity in that age range. And then you sort of develop an attitude, and the attitude is, okay, I can either use this as fuel and grist for the mill and say, listen, I'm going to take all of that negativity and channel it toward, more strength and more positivity and building and maybe you get a little bit of a chip on your shoulder sometimes, or you can kind of let it break you down.
And do you remember, some of the specific instances where you had that kind of exchange? Where was it political? Was it because, of the fact you're always younger, a little bit smarter, maybe you're quick-witted? Do you remember?
Yeah, political, interpersonal.
Yeah.
But I remember, being the kind of kid who, when I was 16 years old, there was a program at the UC system that was all about affirmative action at the UC system. I remember there were about 1,000 people who were protesting down in the plaza over there. And I believe I was the only counter protester.
Interesting.
And I would show up and do that sort of stuff.
Did you was it the confidence or was it gumption? What was it? Was it something your parents distilled in you? Just stand up for ideals, strike out?
I think it was more stand up for ideals, but also, from the time that I was young, I never had any problem with being in crowds or being in front of people.
You were a performer after all.
Yeah, exactly. I played violin. And so if you spend a lot of time playing, a rigorous sort of set of pieces in front of people and you do that over and over and over, it kind of gets rid of whatever trepidation you might have about being in front of people and doing that sort of thing.
Was there a moment when you sort of developed a next level confidence? You're like, wait, I'm pretty good at this. Or was it the writing that was doing?
I'm not sure. I will say, I don't think that it's ever good to develop next level confidence, meaning I think you got to prep for everything. Right. One of the things that I try to do is really over prepare for my show. If I'm going to have a debate or a discussion with somebody, I really try to dig in and get into what's true, what's not true.
Right.
I would much rather be over prepared. I think there's a certain level of insecurity that's good.
Yeah.
I think when you're overconfident, that's when you made mistakes. I think in my career, whenever I've made a mistake, it's typically because I didn't take a challenge seriously enough or I sort of brushed it off.
Yeah.
And you see that happen a lot. People sort of rely on their native intelligence as opposed to assuming that you're not going to be the smartest person in the room all the time. Remember when I was in middle school, so I went to Walter Reed in North Hollywood, and they had a magnet school, like a highly gifted program. And I remember there was an IQ test, actually, kind of a rudimentary IQ test that was the baseline to get in.
Right.
And I got in, but I didn't get in by leaps and bounds. And we, I remember first day of class, everybody was kind of passing around their IQ scores and all this kind of stuff. And one girl had above 180, really, really, really high IQ. And I remember going back home and talking to my father about it. Yeah. He said, listen, you should assume that you're never the smartest person in the room, but you can always be the hardest working person in the room.
Love that.
And that I think has been sort of the motto.
I love it. So you went, UCLA undergrad. Here you are, 17, national syndicated columnist. A few years later, you got 2 published books about issues around the university. As you say, you may have been a step or 2 ahead of most in that respect. And then issues around, it was interesting, the porn industry broadly defined.
Yeah, I was writing books about how the pornography industry was going to really carve out particularly young men's souls in about 2005. And at the time, people were saying, oh, this is crazy. What is he talking about? Now, of course, I think that there are a lot of young men who have fallen prey to that industry, who needs less family formation, less general happiness, less sex, actually. People who are kind of falling out of the social fabric that's necessary to build societies. I was calling that out in about 2005.
It's interesting. Even in my State of the State last week, I referenced just one of many different statistics, but roughly half of young men have never asked a woman out in person on a date. So your point and emphasis in that, and I want to unpack that a little bit later as well in the conversation. But you started then to not only identify yourself in the context of your intellectual pursuits and expressing your point of view through writing, also sort of gifted capacity to engage in debate and speech. But then you found Andrew Breitbart, who was out and about in Southern California, and you took a job there working at Breitbart.
That had been in 2012 during the 2012 election. I joined Breitbart. I'd known Andrew actually since my UCLA days. So I'd known him already for quite a number of years.
What do you think of Andrew? A lot of
Andrew's a kick. So I think that there's sort of you're in public life, so there's for a lot of people, there's sort of like the private person and there's the public person. They're not quite the same. So Andrew, the private person and the public person were actually very much the same, I would say, up until the end. Toward the end, I think that Andrew became very frustrated with a lot of the political system, media coverage. But the truth is that Andrew was, for the vast majority of the time I knew him, very garrulous, willing to have conversations with nearly anyone. I think that if you talk to people who knew Andrew really well, their best memories of him are things like him just rollerblading in Venice and then just having like political conversations, taking somebody to coffee, like a random person. What I used to say to people about Andrew is that I knew Andrew for over a decade before he passed away. And if you knew Andrew for 5 minutes, you knew him about 95% as well as I did, because he was just very much there. Like he was just on the surface. Everything what you saw is what you got with Andrew. I joined Breitbart in about 2012. It was during the Romney-Obama election cycle. Right. I was there for a few years. I believe I ended up leaving in 2016, like early 2016. Right. There had been some sort of career transitions there in which I was taking other jobs at the same time. There was a point, again, going under that sort of working hard rubric. There's one which I was working effectively 4 jobs. I was doing a morning show in LA where I interviewed you, actually. And then there was an afternoon show that I was doing in Seattle. So that was 6 hours of radio a day. I was the editor at large of Breitbart, which meant writing a piece or 2 a day for Breitbart. And then I had also taken a job as the editor-in-chief of a website called Truth Revolt for the David Horowitz Freedom Center. So I was working 4 jobs simultaneously. My advice to young people, particularly, you want to be successful, say yes to doing everything, even if it's for free at the beginning, because eventually saying yes a lot gets you the power to say no later on in your career when you can sort of winnow down what will make you successful.
And a lot of folks know this, but a lot of folks don't. Steve Bannon was down there working for Breitbart at the time. You guys got along initially?
I know.
Even in the beginning.
Steve is not the easiest person to get along with. I will say that.
We'll talk a little bit more just briefly. I don't want to over-index with Steve, but so you left in 2016, but in 2015 you more formally established what more commonly is identified with the Daily Color, right? I mean, it was
Daily Wire. Right. So Daily Wire we established formally in 2015, right? So it would have been in the middle of the primary. So it would have been 2016. Yeah. That's when we formally launched, was a few months before the election of 2016. I'd been working at the David Horowitz Freedom Center. There's kind of a funny story there where we had Jeremy Boring and I, who were business partners. He had been working there, and he basically hit upon what was a social media arbitrage plan. He basically saw that you could market on social media in new ways, and that would bring you traffic. And we proposed this to the board. They legitimately did not understand what we were talking about because boards of nonprofits are famously, sort of elderly and non-tech involved. And so we made a presentation. Jeremy was kind of fondly known as the stupid whisperer because we had met with many Congress people, and I speak quickly, and Jeremy spoke slowly with a Southern accent, and so he would very often get across better to those Congress people who shall remain unnamed. Anyway, we met with the board. Jeremy sort of explained the marketing plan. They had no idea what he was talking about. They turned to me and they said, Ben, can you explain the marketing plan? I said, sure, very easy. I was frustrated by this point, so I took out a napkin and I wrote on it, $, arrow, Facebook, arrow, website, arrow back to $.
It's in your book.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And that was the marketing plan, right? It was that you were going to spend money on social media in order to gain eyeballs. Those eyeballs would then provide advertising on your website, and then you would just direct that money back into Facebook. And so it was kind of a flywheel. And they fired Jeremy the next day. I quit a couple of days later, and then we basically took that plan out to market. We found a little bit of seed funding. It was about $5 million in seed funding originally. And we launched Daily Wire, which last year did $200 million plus in revenue.
How many employees now? Daily Wire?
We have about 220 employees.
Wow.
At Daily Wire.
And you guys are doing we can talk more specifically, but it's documentaries, it's movies,
yes,
it's all this show. It's a whole suite of
we've
things.
tried to turn it into a semi-major media company, right?
Yeah.
I would say it's probably the second biggest conservative media company in the country after Fox.
So at the time, who were your mentors? Who were you looking up to at the time? Who did you want to become? Andrew obviously had a big impact, I assume, in terms of your trajectory. Who else was out there you were watching? Was it the Limbaughs of the world? Was it the Savages of the world? On radio?
Yeah. I think it was sort of a different thing in every industry.
Yeah.
So from a sort of ideological point of view, just being a great writer, be people like Charles Krauthammer.
Yeah,
which of course I love the writing. That's actually my favorite thing that I do because I can sit there, organize my thoughts, and I happen to write incredibly quickly. So that's very nice. And then from a radio or podcast point of view, obviously Rush is sort of the granddaddy of us all in this industry. And so Rush was the guy who I grew up listening to on talk radio.
Yeah.
Him, Larry Elder, like everybody who's sort of in the LA radio sphere when I was growing up.
Yeah.
And then in sort of social media land, obviously Andrew was a major force in sort of showing what you could do in the new media. And so I'd say that triumvirate would be a pretty good way of defining.
What else? And were you inspired? At the time, just even beyond those examples, were there books you were reading at the time, periodicals that really inspired?
So
you?
I read incessantly. I've been reading 3 to 5 books a week since I was probably old enough to read.
Wow.
So, the books that I was reading on economics were things like Hayek, right? I spend actually less time engaging, I would say, with, the non-traditional media space than I do engaging with books and great ideas, I hope. That's where I'd like to spend my time. Also, I'm lucky from Friday night to Saturday night, I can't engage with media, right? I'm an Orthodox Jew, so all of the electricity goes away.
Yeah.
And so I read a lot of books, fewer now than I used to because I have 4 kids now. But that means that if I want to, what's great about that for what I do is that if a topic comes up in the news, I have a pretty good memory bank to draw on in terms of a baseline of knowledge that I can then supplement with sort of further research. But I have a very strongly defined kind of worldview about everything from economics to foreign policy to social policy that I hope is rooted in some fundamental values, which means that I would say that my level of political consistency has been pretty high over the course of the last couple of decades. I'm 42, about to turn 42 years old this week. And I've been in this industry for a quarter century. I started writing at 17. And if you read stuff from when I'm 17, if it wasn't highly dumb, which some of it is, but if you were to find a column I wrote when I was 23 and it wasn't one of the ones that was like trying to get attention and look at me, if it was one of my more serious columns, it would probably look a lot like the stuff that I'm saying today.
What do you make of the current media landscape? It seems to be the sort of dialectic between the old and the new, sort of the digital first and these legacy media companies. Obviously podcasts becoming at least part of the it's a conversation. I don't know. We can get into the merits of overstating, over-indexing podcast influence. But so much of what you seeded and influenced in terms of the right-wing media, even in now in some respects, what folks are trying to replicate with more progressive media voices. What do you make of the landscape today? How would you describe the current landscape?
I mean, it's highly fragmented. I think in some ways that's good. I think in some ways that's bad. It's had tremendous benefits in the sense that you don't have three networks and you have to rely on just those three networks. You can in real time fact check things. It's bad in the sense that while gatekeeping is difficult and obviously can silo off information that you need to have, if you have people who are algorithmically driven, who are desperate for clicks and desperate for attention and don't seem to care very much about the truth, and if there's kind of no pushback, then bad information can spin its way around very, very quickly. And it doesn't take long for people to draw extremely hard narratives about, I would say, convoluted sets of facts.
Yep.
And I think that, frankly, politicians sometimes have a position in doing this, because if you're catering to a base, and obviously, listen, everybody has to be aware of audience capture. In my industry, in politics, you have to be very aware of audience capture because you need to win votes. But I mean, just to take as a recent example, what happened in Minneapolis, I think that the normie response to what happened in Minneapolis is, this is obviously a tragedy from a sort of legal perspective. Putting on my lawyer hat, the intent of Renee Good is not relevant to the question of the intent of the officer, right? If you're gonna prosecute the officer, then you'd have to determine whether an objective, reasonable officer would have perceived that he was being threatened by her vehicle when he shot her. And it seems to me that you could voice a fairly strong defense in a court of law that an objectively reasonable officer, since he actually was nudged with the car at the very least, would have perceived it that way. Now, this immediately broke down into two separate narratives, both of which I think are untrue. One was a narrative that was immediately pushed by the Trump administration and Secretary of Homeland Security Kristi Noem, that she was a domestic terrorist who was attempting to run over officers with her car and was legitimately trying, not just this officer, but multiple officers. That was the original statement. I said at the time, I thought that was untrue. And then your press office tweeted out that it was state-sponsored terrorism, which, I mean, Governor, I do have to ask you about that. That sort of thing makes our politics worse.
Yeah.
I mean, it does.
Yeah.
I mean, our ICE officers obviously are not terrorists.
Yeah.
A tragic situation is not state-sponsored terrorism.
Yeah, I think that's fair.
I mean, when it comes to ICE, I mean, I'll ask you this just generally about policy with regard to ICE, because obviously it's become incredibly contentious given what the federal government is doing in states like California. It seems to me that there have been a number of deportations from red states, right, where there are governors and localities working with ICE. California is a sanctuary state, which makes it much more difficult for local law enforcement to hand over information to ICE about deportation status. What's the purpose of that? Wouldn't best policy, you're pragmatic, you talk about your pragmatism all the time, wouldn't best policy be to cooperate with ICE in the vast majority of cases? So instead of ICE going to, as you say, hospitals and churches to pick people up, they'd be going to jailhouses to pick people up.
That's exactly what they do in California. And we have over 10,000 that I've cooperated with since I've been governor of California. We work very directly with ICE as it relates to CDCR, our state prison. California has cooperated with more ICE transfers probably than any other state in the country. And I vetoed multiple pieces of legislation that have come from my legislature to stop the ability for the state of California to do that. So when it comes to the issues of violent criminals, when it comes to felons, people that are being released from the largest state system in the United States of America, California cooperates with ICE.
Okay, but why is it then, what makes it a sanctuary state?
The broader sanctuary policies that are established, and we had a policy that was established under Governor Brown, SB 54. You have city sanctuary policies that go back quite literally to the time Ronald Reagan was governor, and it relates to some of the issues in Central America, sort of the origin stories. But the bottom line is relates to those policies, this notion that federal law should be enforced by federal law enforcement agencies, that we should not consign local law enforcement to federal responsibilities and prioritization.
Right, but shouldn't the state step in with localities and tell localities that they ought to cooperate better with ICE, thus to facilitate?
Well, I have sort of Rudy Giuliani's point of view, who made the point as an advocate for sanctuary policy when he was mayor of New York. He said it keeps people safer, healthier, and more educated. Safer in the context that it allows community members to be more likely to participate as witnesses of crime or victims of crime in going after the perpetrators, more likely to get an immunization shot if they're not worried about the nurse turning them over to ICE, more likely to go to school and get educated if they're not worried about the school crossing guard crossing them and ultimately turning them over to ICE. So it's the tool of pragmatism because of the complete abject failure of the federal government. A sanctuary policy is unnecessary if we had comprehensive immigration reform and we had a federal response that was adequate to the task. But in the absence of that, it's grown from the 70s and 80s and 90s, 2000s. And obviously I got here as governor and we had an established framework before I got here.
But
SB
it
54.
is true that sanctuary policy obviously has had a massive impact as a driver of tremendous number of illegal immigrants in the state of California.
I don't know about that. I mean, you see in a lot of states that don't have sanctuary policies, huge increase in immigration, illegal immigration, massive increases, even far greater than the state of California. Just look as an example. But in
terms of the cost structure, I mean, you recently, for example, had to freeze the enrollment of undocumented immigrants in state health systems to save money, right? I mean, these are major burdens. No,
that's a separate issue. There are 12 states that provide health care for undocs, and we believe in universal health care regardless of pre-existing conditions.
My only point is that the cost structure is extraordinarily burdensome.
But I don't think it's in unpacking it. I don't think it's the sanctuary policies that are driving that. And I'll give you a proof point. Florida doesn't have sanctuary policy. Huge increase in undocumented community. Huge increase in Texas. It's not a driver, their sanctuary policy. They don't have sanctuary policies in those states. The state of California's policies, I don't think in that respect, have invited people into our state. And I use those as, I think, proof points of that. And that's a different. So the notion of how do you deal with people that are here 10, 15 years? How do you deal with mixed status families in the state? And how do you provide for health care as opposed to emergency care and stabilize populations and community health? It's a different approach. It's one that we've been very transparent about. It's one that's hardly unique because in every state they provide compensated care for undocs at the emergency room. Many states provide it for children, many for seniors. California provides it across the board.
I mean, the biggest problem, though, as somebody who left the state, is that the cost structure in the state has become so burdensome, not just because of illegal immigration, but generally. And so the idea that policy has no impact as a magnet for particular human behavior or alienating people from a state, that's clearly untrue.
Yeah,
and when you look at the homeless population, for example, friendlier policies toward providing services in Santa Monica
Separate
led to
point, though. But now you're getting a homeless policy, not immigration policy.
No, but
I
want to stick
up
with immigration policy.
No,
if you make it easier for illegal immigrants,
but let's stick with immigration
to
policy.
avoid ICE, then presumably.
No, look, I appreciate this. So we've established an important. I appreciate the question because I'm glad we've established that we do cooperate with ICE in California. In particular, this governor, who's, as I said, on multiple occasions vetoed efforts to stop me from that coordination for dangerous criminals, and we've done that over 10,000 folks.
So it'd be wrong for us. So when AOC said this week that ICE should be abolished, you disagree?
Oh, I disagree when I think a candidate for president by the name of Harris said that in the last campaign. I came out, I remember being on Chris Hayes hours later saying, I think that's a mistake. So absolutely. Number two, as it relates to the issue of sanctuary policy, I think it's important to establish because it's not well established. Sanctuary jurisdictions have lower crime rates than non-sanctuary jurisdictions. So this notion that it somehow increases crime is also, I think, contradicted on the basis of the facts. So this notion that population, it becomes an attractive nature for population increases, I think is contradicted by the facts. As it relates to crime, it's contradicted by the facts, but there's unquestionably, and you're right about this, as it relates to an expansion of services, but not just for sanctuary jurisdictions, for population, diverse populations. Yes, there are states like California that have chosen a different approach.
And that approach, I mean, means that when you came into office, for example, the budget was, $200 billion, and your proposed budget last year or this year was $350 billion. You went from a surplus.
The general fund's $248 billion. We have $42.3 billion additional revenue structure than we anticipated. By the way, another 2.8 came in December. And California is now replenishing its reserves, $23 billion, paying down pension obligations, $11.8 billion. There's no question there are cost pressures as it relates to Medicaid, and Medi-Cal in California. And those pressures are going to be made worse because of the big, beautiful bill.
Well, I mean, I think that the main pressures in the state of California in terms of kind of future costs looks like some of the programs that you mentioned, mainly, if we're going to look at it, CalPERS, CalSTARS, the fact that you have perhaps $500 billion in unfunded liabilities going forward.
Well, in which we've substantially improved in the last 7 years. I just mentioned the $11.8 billion commitment. We've highlighted that in the State of the State to pay down long-term pension obligations. STRS and PERS, their funded liability has been improving over the last 5 or 6 years. Can't make up for the last 30 years. You may recall a decade plus ago, we did reforms for new employees moving in. We dealt with spiking and other issues and abuses in that space. We're hardly unique in this country as it relates to unfunded liability.
Or fraud issues, obviously.
And fraud issues. We can talk about fraud all day. I'd love to talk about that, and we could get back to that because I think it's an incredibly important topic. And California's been actually out front on a lot of these anti-fraud efforts, and I think there's a lot of BS in this space as it relates to sort of targeted assaults and offense that obviously are pain our politics. But I want to go back because we're going to get all of this. I know everyone came here for all this stuff.
Of course. Before we do, I just want to ask, there's sort of a general take that I have, and that is, so I heard the podcast that you did with Ezra Klein. I think Ezra is wonderful. He and I disagree about nearly everything, and I think Ezra is really, really a fascinating person with a lot of really interesting and heterodox ideas. And he talked with you a lot about sort of governance, and you talked with him a lot about how you were trying to remove regulatory barriers to, for example, building units, right? Because when you came into office, you wanted to build, I believe it was 3.5 million units.
That was the stated need,
right?
Then we created a legal framework of 2.5 million,
and it will come up way short of that, but it's like 2030. And what is it? About 150,000 units that are being created.
Little less than 150,000. You're right, about 111, 108,000.
And this isn't a rip on you. I mean, because
it's been a major national issue, and the macroeconomics of this with interest rate environment, sort of post-COVID environment, made this housing crisis across the country.
Although to be fair, the housing crisis in California is particularly bad. I mean, there are places like Phoenix or Austin or there's
the original. I said yesterday or last week in the state of states, the original sin, our inability to get out of our own way on all the regulatory thickets.
Right. So
we blew through those in the last couple of years. 61 housing reform bills we just passed, and Ezra was highlighting that. Interesting. Yes. New York just moved in a direction. I think finally we Democrats broadly are moving now finally in the right direction after decades and decades. Democrats and Republicans in California neglect in this space.
Right. And I think that one of the problems that people see, and there's been a big question, you've asked it, you've talked about it a lot actually, about the frustration that people have with politics and the disenchantment that people have and the feeling that no matter what they do, they can't get ahead. And that's manifesting in a lot of political polarization. And this gets to, I think, a sort of broader issue. It's not just you. So I don't mean this to be a specific critique of you. I think it's a critique of a lot of politicians that I have left and right. Yeah. And that is, you look at the system, you realize as the governor how complex the system is, how difficult it is to get things done, how much gridlock there is in the system. But politicians, in order to get elected, have to make a lot of promises about how much things are going to change in the future. Yep. And they usually are talking about using the power of government in order to facilitate and make that change happen, particularly on the Democratic side of the aisle. And it seems to me that is a recipe for disaster for the American body politic, because if you make promises that cannot be fulfilled, because the system does not allow for it to be fulfilled, people inherently end up frustrated. And, I have relatives who still live in the state of California. I visit it routinely, and they're making a very good living. Right? I have a sister-in-law and brother-in-law who live in LA. They make a combined excellent living, and they're barely making their mortgage. And the housing costs are too high. The cost of living is too high. I believe the poverty rates in California on a cost-adjusted basis are some of the highest in the nation. Right there with Florida, correct. When you look at the supplemental poverty index, when you look at poverty broadly, you find it's slightly above average. Supplemental, Florida and California, right if there. You're looking at real estate costs in particular are extraordinary in the state of California. And as you say, you're trying to remove regulations, but the problem is that unless we are willing to recognize a fundamental reality, which is that the relationship of the American people with their government needs to change. Oh, I agree with that. And what that means is that we need to radically remove the regulatory structures that allow for more building, that we need to radically stop perverting markets when it comes to how we make housing policy, that we need to stop wasting money in taxpayer funding on things like, for example, a gigantic, you once called it a boondoggle, high-speed rail that is going to cost in excess of $100 billion in this state. Right. The guarantee, and again, I see it rising on the populist right too, which is sort of a big government right, which is something I object to on a sort of classically conservative level. The promises that are made that if you give government more power and more taxpayer revenue, that suddenly these problems are going to be alleviated, and the actual result, which is less ability to do what my parents did, to move from a 2-bedroom small house in Burbank to a 4-bedroom, slightly larger house in North Hollywood. And then for me to go to a great state school like UCLA, and then for me to go to Harvard Law School, and now to have a really, really nice house I did have a nice house in California before we left, obviously. Those obstacles need to be removed.
Well, you sound like me. I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, we can get high-speed rail aside. You made my speech and my argument the last 3 years in terms of the housing reforms we pursued. Could not agree more. I highlighted the 61 bills just last year. I didn't highlight the 42 CEQA reform bills. The original, talk about process and regulatory thickets. Those environmental rules that were established, ironically, by Ronald Reagan himself when he was governor of California. So we've been in the process of doing precisely what you're suggesting we need to do, and we've been doing it very meaningfully and been nation-leading reforms in this space. Now, of course, the private sector needs to catch up in the context of interest rate environment becoming more favorable. But now we are cities and counties we put on notice. May you recall when I first became governor, I sued Huntington Beach, the first city, because they were out of compliance with their housing element. We established a legally binding goal of 2.5 million units. We talked about the stretch goal, what needed to get some equilibrium in our prices, the supply-demand imbalance, but we created a legally binding goal of 2.5 million.
So what could be done to make that happen in not Huntington Beach, but LA, San Francisco?
We created a housing accountability unit. We pursued 46 actions. We've unlocked
right, but I guess the question is from like the common man perspective, right? From my perspective, where I left, I took my business, right?
Yeah.
From that perspective, how do we get to the material change? And if we cannot, then perhaps that requires a complete rethink. Come over to my classical libertarian economics here, Governor, is I guess what I'm saying, and maybe recognize that the amount of tax revenue that's taken in the state perverts the market incentives. That what's been generated in the state is a middle class that is really struggling.
Yeah,
vast social services for people who are at poverty line or below and slightly above. And then, a group of people who are either so wealthy they don't care or so wealthy now they're leaving, right? Because of the prospective wealth tax, which I know you oppose, right? You understand markets. So that's why I'm always a little bit bewildered when there are measures taken by the state legislature that end up perverting markets in fairly serious ways.
Well, we can get into the crony capitalism, state capitalism, and the tithings from NVIDIA and AMD and what's going on with Intel and what's happening with the Trump administration in that respect. But I agree with you broadly in all this. I mean, the fact is we've been tackling all. I can't make up for 50, 60 years. And you're talking about literally a 50-year trend line as it relates to the issues of cost of housing and affordability. But I can talk in terms of the substantive actions we've taken, tripling their income tax credits for working families, creating a child tax credit, foster tax credit, doing more as it relates to pre-distribution opportunities.
How about radically lowering the income tax rates in the state?
California has tax. I mean, there's 16 states right now. Let's talk about those 16 states.
Why don't we talk about California? That's
I'm going to that tax their low-wage earners more than California taxes its high-wage earners. Let's talk about lowering those tax rates in those 16 states. How about the middle class? 40% of the middle class in Texas pay higher taxes than they do in California. We have the highest tax rate for the 1%, but the overall tax burden, and there's been independent analysis after independent analysis, is marginally higher than the national average.
Okay.
So the tax rate for the 1%, you're in that bubble. But 99% empirically are not.
As a person who grew up in California and spent my entire career in California, I paid every single tax rate in the state of California. Yeah. And I started off making, when I first got out of school and I'd quit the law firm, I was making maybe $60,000 a year.
So you started out paying less than you would in a dozen plus other states.
And I didn't
It's a progressive tax state.
I understand it's a progressive tax state. The problem is that when I left, I also took 80 employees. Yeah. And there's somebody who's got to pay the bills for those employees, and that's typically not the state. The person who is paying the bills for the employees, and the person
as the guy who's created. By the way, you're talking to a guy who started right out of college, pen to paper, and started 23 small businesses. Literally 23. Created almost 1,000 jobs.
So as a person who ran a small business, you wanted to pay salaries to your people.
Honored.
Well, yeah, right. I mean, it's not about the greed of the one person.
I'm
the same person that
I hated a lot of the regulations, and I've been fighting against a lot of those.
And having to fire people because of that stuff is awful.
I agree.
And losing your profit margin, which allows you to hire more people, is a bad thing. And when you're seeing, I mean, I've talked to major tech founders who say today that they would not, if they had to do it over again, they would not found in California, specifically because of the regulatory and tax structure.
Well, let's talk about the largest startup in world history. Could have chosen any place to open its headquarters just recently. OpenAI and the folks there decided to open in San Francisco. I mean, it runs.
That's where the talent is. I mean, there's no question.
Therein lies the formula for success. California has more Fortune 500 companies than it's ever had in 20 plus years.
To be fair, you have 40 million people who live
Well,
here.
hold on, but 4 years ago that wasn't the case. Today it's the case. We have 58 Fortune 500 companies. When I started, it was 49. We're the 6th largest economy. Now we're the 4th largest economy. You look at the 3.1 million jobs that have been created since I've been governor. You can look across the spectrum. I'm not denying its challenges, but those persist and exist in every other state. You move to a state that has higher insurance rate, higher car insurance, not just home insurance, has higher property taxes. Many of these red states, they have higher murder rates, lower wages, lower productivity, less innovation and entrepreneurialism. They're less contributory to the GDP of this country.
Okay, so, I mean, not to defend my current state, Florida.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously you had a debate with Governor DeSantis where you guys had this discussion.
Yeah.
But I will say that, you know, some of the statistics that you use with regard to California are aggregate statistics, not on a per capita basis. So I've heard you say, for example, that that California is the top innovation state because it has the highest number of new businesses founded. On a per capita basis, that isn't true. You've said
How about
that,
on a per capita basis, more Floridians move into California than Californians to Florida?
I mean, that's
Per
fine.
capita basis.
That's fine. And on absolute,
Okay, I just want to, let's establish the per capita frame. Per capita murder rate. Let's look at infant mortality per capita.
Well, we can look at violent assault rates. We can look at property crime rates.
I don't know,
but it's not.
I mean, Jacksonville versus San Francisco.
California, outside of immigration, has had a net loss of population for the past several years.
But immigration is part of the secret sauce of California going back to its origins.
I understand, but if you lose people like me and the 80 employees I took with me and members of my family,
I'm not happy about anyone leaving the state, but population's grown 3 years in a row. The last time it declined, it went down with 11 other states, and we lost 151 people.
If you're talking not about immigration, if you're just talking about people who lived in California who are leaving, that number is high. And again, I'm not blaming that on you.
It could be the case in many, many states, as you know, across this country.
100%.
By the way, a lot of red states, which I'm surprised you guys don't talk more about. What about the last few years, all these red states losing folks? California hasn't been the last few years. These red states are Louisiana, Mississippi. Let's talk about those states. Let's talk about the murder rate. Adding to the top 10 murder rates in America are in red states. I think there's some real problems. The most regressive taxes in the country are in these red states. Who are you for?
I mean, the question really, again, you're the governor of California, not the governor of Louisiana. If I'm speaking with the governor of Louisiana, I'd be very happy to talk about.
I just never hear anyone talk about the governor of Louisiana and the population decline.
Yeah, because I'm aware the governor of Louisiana, probably wasn't running for president, and also doesn't.
I don't know. Who knows? Everyone else seems to be running for president.
I never lived in Louisiana.
You're running for president. By the way, let's get back to that. Bannon is running for president. He said.
Oh goodness.
You don't buy that?
No, I buy that Steve would run a vanity campaign in order to garner a few dollars and some more attention for himself. Sure, why not?
I'm gonna get back to all the California bashing here in a second because I know everyone wants to tune in on that. But I want to keep going a little bit, and just in the interest of you coming all the way out from that red state of Florida, because it is interesting, just in terms of just as you laid out the framework of the media environment in this country, and how fragmented it's become, et cetera. This notion of trust and truth, and how things are weaponized, and how everybody, society becomes how we behave, and how you indicted a little bit my press office, which I appreciated the direct point you made on that. And I'm not naive about that. I think about that all the time. When we put up a mirror to Trump, we become more like him. And are you complicit in that?
Not unique to you. Yeah. Obviously, we've had things at our company that have been said. That's not unique. I will say that I think that for elected politicians who are hoping for a better future where we all come together, it is a problem. And, I don't like the catastrophism. I've criticized it on the right too. The sort of catastrophism that you see in a functioning democracy, which is what the United States is. It is a functioning republic. For example, when the president decided to push for redistricting and then you push back with your proposition, I actually didn't have a problem with that. I thought, that is a normal use of the political mechanisms in order to fight back by one side against another. What I do have a problem with is if you go on Stephen Colbert and say you're worried there won't be a legit election in 2028.
But I feel that. I mean, if I believe that.
Do you really believe that?
I really believe that.
But then why are you running? Or why would you consider running?
I want to make sure because we have agency, we can shape the future. It's not something to experience.
But I didn't believe it when President Trump said it. So President Trump said in 2020.
I think I believe in it, but he tried to.
You truly believe that President Trump is going to try to run in 2028?
No, I believe that he'll try to wire the outcome in 2028. I really believe that.
This sort of stuff is very dangerous to me. I heard it from the right in the aftermath of 2020. And you'll recall I was one of the few on the right who said this is not true. Right, that Joe Biden was legitimately elected in 2020, and that if someone could provide me evidence that he was not, that was sufficient to overcome the burden of proof.
You saw what Trump tried to do.
Well, I mean, what is the thing that you think?
I mean, he's dialing up for 12,000 votes in Georgia. He ended up pardoning. I mean, were you supportive of every one of these pardons?
I'm not justifying.
Try to light democracy on fire.
I'm not justifying what he said to Brad Raffensperger over in Georgia.
Yeah.
Brad Raffensperger, by the way, did the right thing. I think Mike Pence did the right thing, by the way, in certifying the election. But my point is that when it comes to, if you want the country to continue to work together, then if you set the predicate, if I lose, it was rigged, and this is true for either side.
I can't stand that.
Then we need some objective
agree
metrics.
with you on that.
Then if you're going to say that, we need some objective metrics by which we can adjudicate whether or not the election will be fairly decided. And it seems to me that just in terms of how elections are conducted globally, and again, I'm in favor of many of these sort of election reforms that have been proposed, for example, voter ID. I think it's kind of silly to argue that you shouldn't have to show ID when you vote. But do I think that we are at high risk in the United States of full-scale national elections with 150 million voters being stolen, and that the elective leadership is then fundamentally illegitimate, which leaves you with no choice, presumably, but to go to the mattresses, which is what you don't want?
No,
like that sort of language, I think, is really, really
and I don't
dangerous.
see it on. But back to the point you were making earlier about the aggregate, we're talking about a few thousand votes here and there that ultimately determine that election for the nation on the basis of the electoral map. So I think it's more prone to concern than you may suggest.
But I think that concern, by the way, out specific problems so that we can actually agree on the specific solutions.
I'm with you, and that's why I'm calling it out now. And I try to provide evidence to back up my point as it relates to the Department of Justice and how it gets weaponized. And I've seen it from my party as well. Sure as hell seen it from Trump's perspective. What they try to do with the Bortak teams the day of the election here under Prop 50, where they send folks out and these guys all dressed up to try to chill free expression and free speech on election day, where Trump tweets out that morning saying this is a rigged election. The fact that he's out there suggesting that all the vote by mail is illegal, and a bunch of illegal immigrants are out there doing all of these things. You start stacking them, including trying to rig midterm elections as it relates to changing the maps, and what he tried to do on January 6th. Yeah. I start getting a little bit concerned.
I don't want to lump all those things in together because I don't think they're all the same.
They're not all the same, but they stack together from my perspective. It's not one action. It's a sum total of all of those things, including sending out ICE.
But it's very difficult to argue. Here's the thing. It's very difficult to argue over intentions because now I'm in the business of mind reading, which I can't do. Trump's
not. He's telling you what he thinks.
I know, and I will
so
criticize him
when
he says what he thinks. I'll criticize. So, for example, when he said 2020 was a rigged election, he said, you'll recall, in 2020, on the night of the election, he said I won before all the results were in. I came out before anybody, and I said that's wrong. The election is not over yet. All the votes have not been counted.
Good for you.
So I tried to. I try, and I think the responsible thing to do is, and I don't always do this, but I think that the responsible thing to do is to try and hone in on the specific behavior. So, you mentioned that it would be election rigging, if President Trump is pushing for gerrymandering in Indiana. I don't think that's election rigging. I don't think it's election rigging when you gerrymander in California. I think that is a long practice part of American politics. Yeah. And I don't think that you did anything wrong, actually, in pushing for it in California, as much as it does not benefit the party that I tend to vote for, right, and of whom I'm a member, of which I'm a member. So, when the general tenor, and this is what I see in democratic crises that you see around the world, one of the things that I see is both sides saying, if the other side wins, it was rigged.
Yeah, I'm with you on that, though. I'll double down on being crystal clear. I can't stand that any more than you can stand that. I couldn't agree with you more. I'm concerned about the inputs between now and 2028. Including concerned about folks that well, Steve Bannon and others, saying there'll be a third Trump term. The fact that I was in the
I think Steve's totally full of shit. And by the way, I think that people should stop giving Steve attention for saying things that are complete horseshit.
And I appreciate that. But should I give attention to Donald Trump when I sat there in the Oval Office for 90 minutes and he tells me to turn around and there's a picture on the wall or painting on the wall of FDR, and I look at him and I smile and I said, oh, here's the third term. He goes, what about 4 terms? Should I take him seriously?
Okay, so
should I take him literally?
I will say,
I don't know. I'm just a question.
I know, and my general
answer. That's the president.
And my general answer to this is, if we've watched Donald Trump for 10 years, and we're still doing the thing where we all take him explicitly literally, I think that so
Maduro did.
So people
or has.
Okay, it turns out Maduro should have. But one of the things that I remember I would get this critique about President Trump a lot is President Trump, who, as I've said multiple times, on his epitaph, it will read 45th and 47th president of the United States. He said a lot of shit. Like the thing
I don't know,
that
I'm
I'm not going to
old-fashioned.
pretend.
I take my presidents a little more seriously
See,
than most.
I don't think you do. And this is the thing where I really doubt it. I see a lot of people who Trump will fire off a random tweet, and everybody kind of laughs because it's President Trump. If I'm going to pretend that is coming from the same thought process as whatever comes from Joe Biden's press office, which went through 7 layers and maybe not the president,
very different.
Then I'm not gonna pretend that's the same thing because I'm not an idiot, you know.
And that's look. And by the way, I could not agree even more. And that's, I think, reflected in the humor I'm trying to put back in on my social media.
And actually, I think it's kind of a problem for you because I think that, frankly, the stuff that you're doing is more thought out than the stuff that President Trump does. Meaning, I think that President Trump is waking up at 3 a.m. if he went to sleep at all, and he's firing off stuff on Truth Social, right? And so, am I supposed to take that as seriously as you, in a methodical fashion, saying, you know what, I'm going to prank him back? And I think that people who are your supporters do take you in that way more literally than they would be apt to take President Trump.
A lot of my support has been offended by by what we're trying to do, but no, look, and a lot, I think, appreciate the humor that we bring to it, and I do think I think it's reflected in a sense of agreement that we have in that respect as it relates to what Trump puts out all the time. But
like, if you win the 2028 election, I will call you president of the United States, right? Because that election will be legitimate, and if it's J.D. Vance or Marco Rubio or whoever else,
as I was, as an American, I called Donald Trump president of the United States, Mr. President. Of course, and so I'm with you on that.
Yes.
On the outcome, but that doesn't suggest that I believe for a second, and you haven't respectfully convinced me that I'm wrong or errant, that he won't do everything in his power to manipulate the outcome. I think it's time of life. If he was 20 years younger, I absolutely believe he'd run for a 3rd term. But his time of life suggests that that's not going to be the case. But I do think he's going to try to hardwire.
This also implicates, you see the reason I'm concerned about this, because it also implicates the guardrails. So as you've talked about, in your state, there's a lot of gridlock, right? There are a lot of various moving parts. When you're trying to get something done at the state level, you've got local governments that can impede you. You've got a legislature that can say no to you, right? You've got a bunch of it. You've got a judiciary that will tell you no in certain areas. There was a ruling a couple of weeks ago that I strongly agree with from the judiciary with regard to, for example, school districts and what they can and should tell parents about their kids.
That's going to be thrown out, but we'll get to that Benitez decision. Yeah.
But when it comes to what President Trump is or is not trying to do, the problem is when we say that he will try to steal the election. Will the election be stolen? That relies now on an opinion about, for example, the Supreme Court of the United States, or an opinion about the various state legislatures and courts. And so now you're not just implicating what President Trump might try to do, you're now implicating pretty much every major institution that is electoral in nature in the country.
There's a lot of evidence, and I know both sides have argued a lot of evidence as it relates to the weaponization of justice and the bias that's expressed in a lot of these federal judicial opinions. And it's it's a little alarming. As a father of a judge who reveres the courts, and as someone that I was very proud of, my father may have been accused of being an activist judge, but he in many occasions calling balls and strikes, and I revere that sense of justice. That's where justice is found, with an objective analysis. But no, I do worry about the Supreme Court. You may not. I'm concerned about the Supreme Court of the United States. I'm concerned about what Donald Trump did after January 6th, the degree that he went to ultimately try to stay in office. Yes, I'm concerned about the actions he's taken, not any one of them from the midterm redistricting, but the sum total of many of them. And yes, I'm concerned if we don't take back the House of Representatives and we have no oversight and we continue to have the supine Congress, we may not have a country that we recognize. I really believe that. I do.
And it's fine to believe all of those things. I will say that to articulate them as though they are all of equal levels of alarm, or that the sum total of them is that if we don't win the next election, the country's over, which again is something that you hear very often from the right too. I think that sort of alarmism is quite bad for American politics. And I don't think that anyone who's in electoral politics actually believes that, because I promise you that if a Republican wins in 2028, a Democrat will then run in 2032. And if the reverse is true, the same thing will happen.
Yeah, I agree with that. Look, I do. I just, the level.
And I think the American people should know that, because it gives them a sense, okay, I didn't win this time, but I might win next time. And once American people start to believe they can never win, or their side is always cut out,
Ben, I love what you're saying. The spirit of what you're saying, I completely concur with. I have a different level of anxiety based upon my own direct experience, not just indirect, direct experience with Donald Trump. my concern about the rule of law, this notion of co-equal branches of government. In your book, you talk about sort of the fundamental Judeo-Christian values in this country, with the best of Greek democracy. I worry about those principles of our founding
I worry about
fathers.
checks and balances too.
Yeah.
And by the way, I think that the best way to do that, actually, and this would benefit you as governor of the state, is devolution of more authority back down to the states, devolution of more governmental authority back down to the local levels, and more robust checks and balances at the
Your
federal
lips
level.
to God in the White House's ears. Yeah, I'm a little.
And I hope you remember that if you become president.
This notion of federalism and 10th Amendment. Yeah, I remember. The red states were arguing for that during those Obama years. God bless you. No, well, back to your being more consistent, and I respect that, and that's why we're here. And I respect you, and I appreciate this opportunity to engage, even though obviously we have fundamental disagreements on a lot of these issues. Maybe not fundamental, just disagreements on a lot of these issues. Let me go back to some of the disagreements, and I don't want to paint too much and color this in, because as a Democrat, it's in my interest to do so. But you got a lot of attention for going recently to America Fest, Turning Point USA. You made a terrible decision of being the first speaker. That's just me saying editorially. What the heck were you thinking?
That is not my decision, right? They invited me. They gave me a slot. That's
just your luck, because then every speaker can come on and
that's okay.
attack.
I got to say what I wanted to say, and then
so paint the picture. What did you say?
Sure.
So people tuning in don't know what the hell we're talking about. You went in and a pretty somber time. Charlie's widow was there. You had a lot of, the sort of branded celebrities in the right, and Candace Owens was there. And
Candace was not there, to be fair.
But became part of the conversation.
She definitely was part of the conversation.
And Bannon and Megyn Kelly, others, so many others. Certainly Tucker Carlson. So give us a sense. What did you say, and why did you say it? And why did you choose that moment to say it?
So the reason that I chose the moment to say it is that Candace Owens, who has some issues of her own, she has been saying since Charlie's death that there was effectively a conspiracy to kill him. She has implicated pretty much everybody, ranging from, believe it or not, French intelligence to the Israelis to various friends and family members, possibly, of Charlie in his murder. Yeah. And there have been an enormous number of people in the influencer space on the right who have gone along with this, who have massaged it, pretended not to notice it, tried to defend her, tried to pretend that it was an aspect of, that questioning her was an aspect of free speech, which of course was a violation of free speech, rather, which of course it isn't. Criticism is not a violation of free speech. It's a form of free speech.
Thank you.
And so I got up on stage and I basically gave a speech saying our responsibility as people with influence in the public space, we have some responsibilities, and those responsibilities include truth above all. Yeah. We ought to be clear about what we believe. We should not hide the ball. We should not allow, quote unquote, friendship to trump what is true. Just because you're friends with someone does not alleviate the responsibility for you to say when they're doing something that is wrong or immoral. We should not engage in audience capture. Just because our audience wants us to say a thing doesn't mean that we ought to say it. And we ought to ensure that we are held responsible for the things that we say, and also the people that we have on and how we question those people. So, of course, anybody has the right to have anybody on their show who they want, and then they should treat those people how they want to treat those people. I mean, if I were to have on somebody who's, in a deeply adversarial position, I think what's great about this conversation is you can see how adversarial we are with regard to some of our positions, but at the same time still have the discussion. Yeah. If you are going to have on, for example, as Tucker Carlson did, Nick Fuentes, who is a self-stated Nazi apologist, and then you're going to treat him with kid gloves, then you ought to be held responsible for that in the court of public opinion. And if we as influencers do not do that job, if we lie to you, if we fib to you, if we make predictions which we are then not held responsible for, if we hide behind, quote unquote, just asking questions, this is one of my bugaboos. I hate it. You hear this a lot in the influencer space, mostly on the right, but some on the left as well. This sort of, I'm not putting out a theory. I'm just asking questions. Well, there's a difference between seeking answers and just asking questions. Seeking answers, that's what questions are for. It's to get better information, more clarification. I should have a better idea after the question of the answer than I did before. Just asking questions is usually a guise for willful ignorance and for positing a theory without having to carry the responsibility for positing that theory. So if I say, I'm just asking questions about whether you have peculiar sexual proclivities, I don't have any evidence, I'm just asking the question. And then you say, well, where is that even coming from? Listen, I'm just asking questions. I'm not asking questions. I'm obviously attempting to impute something to you. This was what this speech was about. I named names in it. I mentioned Tucker Carlson. I mentioned Megyn Kelly, who had sort of gone out of her way to massage Candace Owens in her pursuit of bizarre conspiracy theories about Erica and Charlie's murder.
Yeah.
I mentioned Steve because I think Steve has been doing many of the same things, and so that was the speech at AmFest.
And that you felt it was necessary to name names as opposed to imply. You just felt it was important to be
yes,
clear.
because I think that people should know exactly who they are listening to, particularly since they're going to hear from some of those people at the same event. And so I thought that people should, be forewarned about the people they're going to hear about. Then they can make their own decisions and determine whether my assessment of those personalities is accurate or inaccurate.
And the reaction was exactly as you anticipated.
I think that the reaction in the room was, I think, overwhelming because a lot of people were very upset that people had been saying this about Charlie's murder, which again was carried out by all available evidence by a person motivated by hatred of Charlie's position on transgender issues in particular. And all the evidence points to Tyler Robinson as being the person who shot Charlie Kirk. And so I think that a lot of people in the audience were deeply offended and upset, correctly so, at the kind of specious conspiracy theories that have been promoted by this group of folks. The sort of blowback that came afterward was really interesting. There were a lot of people who obviously were very upset, and many of the people who I'd named, I'm not surprised, came back and fired back. I will say that I don't think any of them actually argued with the point that I was making. They seemed to make collateral attacks, imputing intent to me, suggesting that my speech had something to do with Israel, which is funny since I didn't mention Israel one time in the entire speech. And I found that sort of bizarre. And then obviously you've seen, sort of the influencer wars going on. But the whole point that I was making is, here's a principle. Either you uphold the principle or you don't uphold the principle. If you don't uphold the principle, I'm going to call you out for not upholding the principle. And it really is quite simple. It's not about friendship. It's not about whether we go fishing together. None of that has anything to do with the principle that's at stake. Because if we want to have an honest discussion with one another, then we actually should be honest about the principles that we hold. And if we disagree, we disagree. But clarity before agreement, as my friend Dennis Prager says.
Were you close with Charlie?
I don't want to pretend that we were best friends or anything.
Right.
One of the things I said in the speech is I think that it's pretty rare, actually, in politics for people who say that they're friends in politics. These are usually not people you're going and hanging out with on the weekends. It's not real, okay? Like whenever you hear politicians, oh, we're best friends. It's such bullshit. I'm sorry. It's just bullshit. There may be a couple of exceptions. Yeah. They're rare. Okay. The reality is that they are business colleagues and associates in the same way that most people have business colleagues and associates that they see at the office. We see each other more rarely than you probably see your business colleagues or associates at the office.
You respected how he organized in the campus level.
Charlie
all the echoes of things you were doing.
Listen, Charlie was incredibly gifted as an organizer.
Yeah.
I won't say that we agreed on everything politically because clearly we didn't. But I think that Charlie as a person who was willing to go into fraught spaces, obviously, and he was killed doing this, and to speak his principles to people who disagreed and do so in what I think overwhelmingly was sort of an honest and decent fashion. I think that was a very good thing.
What Tucker Carlson and you history do you?
I'm not sure that we have a history so much as Tucker seems to object to my politics and I object to his. I think Tucker tries to personalize this. I think Megyn has tried to personalize this. I don't believe in personalizing these things. I was asked by somebody, would Tucker and I ever be friends? I said, I'd go fishing with Tucker. I don't care. That doesn't matter to me. The question is his principles and the things that he says. I think that Tucker, I gave a speech right before TPUSA at Heritage Foundation where I pointed out that Tucker is not an advocate for conservatism in any way that I can identify conservatism. He's not in favor of a more limited government of checks and balances. He's come out in favor of feudalism fairly recently. He's not in favor of traditional institutions. He seems to think that they have lost their way. He's in favor of what appears to me a sort of horseshoe theory, Noam Chomsky foreign policy, where America is always the bad actor in the world. And so I think
I read my Chomsky back in the day.
Yeah,
you would not be surprised.
And I think that the biggest thing that Tucker engages in, I mentioned the just asking questions, which he's very fond of, is, and this is something again that is a both sides problem, and that is a general conspiracism about the world. The worst thing happening in our politics is a grievance-based politics that is being set up by actors on both sides, which basically says the failures in your life are generally speaking not your fault. You have no responsibility for them, and you need to shift the burden of your own responsibility over to systems. And so those systems could be the free market is responsible for your failures, or the systems of history are responsible for your failures. And listen, there are real conspiracies out there they exist and usually can provide evidence for them. That's the difference between a conspiracy and a conspiracy theory. But if your going theory is that the reason that you are lacking in life is because the most successful people in your society have rigged the system on their own behalf, and therefore they must be brought low in order for you to succeed, first you need to show me that that's actually evidentiarily the case. You can't just make that claim and then abdicate all responsibility for doing the right things in your own life. And the number one message that I constantly am trying to, give to what I would now call young people, since, I'm of the older generation now, and exactly, is get off your ass and do the thing. I hear people complain, I can't get married. It's just so hard to get married, and no one can get married these days. Bullshit. I'm sorry, that's not true. You absolutely can find someone, and you absolutely can get married. Your grandparents were way poorer than you, and they got married and they had more kids. Hey, this is just nonsense. You are the richest, most privileged people in the history of the world living in the United States today, just relatively speaking. That doesn't mean everything's perfect, because I'm not comparing it to perfect. You can't compare anything in life to perfect. What you can say is that if you are sitting around in a country that has a GDP per capita among the highest on planet Earth, and open jobs, and the ability to move to those open jobs, and the ability to vote on your leaders and not get shot in the streets like people are getting shot in the streets in Iran, you should consider yourself pretty damned fortunate, and maybe you should start with, what can I do to make my life better today, before you figure that it's the system. Now, that doesn't mean there aren't problems with the system, and this is why I like these conversations, and we can get very specific about policy and how we fix a policy so as to make it easier. But I think that the American dream is, you can make it. You can, right? Get government out of your way, get everybody out of your way, right? Let people succeed, and we do need, obviously, a functional social fabric, right? Which is why you've seen a lot of the institutions, like I would say churches, synagogues, break down. That social fabric breaking down is a massive problem, because that's your safety net. When family breaks down, that's your supportive safety net for when things go wrong. We need to on a social level, help restore all of that. But the desire by politicians to say, I alone can fix, which is something President Trump said, but has also been said by, you've got Zohar Mamdani talking about the warm embrace of collectivism, which is insane, by the way.
Nature of campaigns, the campaign promises you made on day one. Right. On day one. And also end the Ukraine-Russian war. Right. Day one.
Or give me more power and I will solve the affordability crisis. Or give me more power and I will ensure that you have a good paying job and you can buy a house on a single income the way that your grandfather could in 1952. And I mean, first of all, let's just be real. The house your grandpa was buying in 1952, you wouldn't want to live in. They're kind of crappy. Okay, it was like a brick box in Detroit, and your grandpa was working on a Ford line riveting. Okay, now you're not. How many people are riveting today? The answer is none. The machines are doing the riveting, right? We should recognize the reality of our situation, as opposed to creating either a false promise of utopia or a false utopian past that wasn't really existing in 1952. The reason we in the United States were able to survive on a one parent income,
52 paychecks versus 104.
It's because the entire rest of the world it had been destroyed. Every place on earth had been destroyed as of 1952. The United States was basically left untouched in the homeland by World War II, and literally every place else had been destroyed. And so that was all an export market for the United States. So much so we had to prop up our export markets by doing things like the Marshall Plan, so people would actually have money to buy things, right? And then it turns out that by the 1960s, reality was setting in, and many of the union contracts that had been negotiated weren't sustainable, and we were being outcompeted by foreign sources. Let's just, again, ignorance of sort of economic history and how people have actually lived throughout history leads to, I think, on the right, a nostalgia for an economic time that didn't exist, and on the left, to a sort of utopianism about what is possible that is also not possible. And I think that we should start from a position in the United States of gratitude and duty and hard work and virtue and recognition that we live in a free country where the vast majority of decisions are your own. And then let's deal with the problems.
And you laid all this out in Lions and Scavengers in detail with historic context and traveled the globe. I mean, each chapter begins with a sense of place, from London to Oxford and in Poland, which is interesting, that section with Elon Musk and others. But let me ask just a little bit. It's interesting, the politics of nostalgia. And I try to paint this, forgive me, keep going back to the state of the state I just gave, but we talked about the politics of nostalgia, try to put America in reverse, but sort of selling this notion of this utopian notion. And it's interesting, you cast some critique, not just on the right, but also on the left in that respect. And I imagine you weren't a big fan of Elizabeth Warren's speech yesterday.
No.
on the basis of what you just said.
But I think Elizabeth Warren was much more interesting when she was a professor at Harvard Law. I was there at the time, and she was writing The Two Income Trap, which was a much more interesting book.
Interesting.
Than where she is now.
Let me just talk about, and I appreciate the trap of promises being promoted in politics, the nature of politics, both political parties, and Trump sort of trapped now on this affordability question. He's in, as we tape this, he's in Michigan. He's part of this affordability tour. You've been, and again, just to your credit, calling balls and strikes. And it goes back even your Breitbart days, as you had some issues with the early aspects of Trump in terms of this sort of just the character personality issues, but you've been a big supporter of him more broadly.
Yeah, I did not vote for either candidate in 2016. I voted for President Trump in 2020, and I actually campaigned on behalf of a bunch of Senate candidates and did some events for President Trump.
And you've been very forceful in your support of what he did in Venezuela, and I think more broadly, just in terms of looking at the picture across the globe, but back here in the United States. As it relates to tariff policy, I've
been very critical of his tariff policy.
You've been critical of tariff policy on other domestic issues. How do you score the first full year of Donald Trump?
So I think that I think the number one domestic issue for President Trump was closing the southern border. A+, right? I mean, that I think put the lie to the Democratic proposal that you needed comprehensive immigration.
But you also acknowledged
for
border. About 6 months, it was substantially 90% closed when Biden decided that he ultimately, to your point, could do something about it, which they suggested they couldn't. Right,
and the fact that they basically lied about that for several years, saying there's nothing we can do. We need congressional action in order to shut the southern border.
We have more areas of agreement on this. Remember,
that was an absurdity.
Put almost 400 National Guard down at the border going back to 2019. So I've been pretty consistent on that basis. And of course, California had to absorb a lot of that on our own with migrant facilities in 3 major counties, 5 migrants that work with Jewish Family Services, Catholic Charities that did God's work, but at the same time, try to put a lid on what was, an unacceptable
situation. So that's a big win for President Trump for sure.
Okay.
So much so that it's not even a top issue for voters anymore.
Well, he seems to forget about it.
Well, I mean, I don't think he's forgotten about it. I think that he made, again, I think a lot of promises with regard to mass deportations that in practicality are probably not fulfillable. And what you see is, Tom Homan, his border czar, who's being a little bit more meticulous about his language.
Where'd the temperance come from? Homan, geez. I know. I'm like, who is this guy?
We're going to go after criminal illegal immigrants. Those are the people who are mostly going to deploy resources.
That's what they said.
And I think that overwhelmingly by the numbers that has been the case as far as I'm aware. But when it comes to
questionable, but I appreciate. There's a lot of different data on that.
As a general rule, I think that's a win for President Trump. Obviously, I agree with the extension of the current tax rates and not allowing them to rise.
You don't agree with? I mean, I hate to bring up Steve Bannon. I mean, this notion of a more progressive tax rate for corporations and the wealthiest among us. I mean,
no, I think it's a bunch of nonsense. And the reason I think that and the reason I think that it's a bunch of nonsense is because corporations are just legal entities. Those legal entities are comprised by people. If you tax a corporation, that is still money that in the end is coming away from the people who comprise the corporation.
You're sounding like Romney when you were covering him with Breitbart.
Well, I mean, this is just like basic black letter econ 101.
Right,
I mean, a corporation doesn't have like a magical existence whereby it hires people. That's not how. There are people who make those decisions. People get paid by the corporation. Most people in the country are getting a paycheck.
All right, we have established you like the big beautiful bill as it relates to the tax structure. You don't give a damn about debt, but that's another conversation.
Oh no, I definitely give a damn about debt, but I do not
Trump
think
doesn't appear to, does he?
I don't think anyone seems to care very much about that, Governor.
Yeah.
I mean, to be fair.
Well, we balance our budgets just for the record.
I mean, kind of.
100%. It's legally, statutorily required.
I mean,
talked about my reserves. We talk about paying down.
So statutorily required that we are running. The last several years, the budget has run what, a $20 billion deficit?
No, I just submitted a balanced budget on a de minimis $2 billion, 2 point something odd billion dollar, which is a rounding error in the state. Balanced budget submitted. Period.
And $500 million of unfunded liabilities, increased tax rates.
Well, we haven't increased taxes since 2011. I haven't increased any taxes, so that's just factually untrue.
I'm not saying that you increased taxes.
But your friends continue to believe Newsom's tax rates. Anyway, let's go back to Trump because I appreciate where you go down the rabbit hole, California. But I want to talk about. It's interesting. So we established from your perspective, he fulfilled his promises on the border. Mass deportations a work in progress, and good people can disagree as it relates to whether or not he'll achieve that. I think it's absolutely.
When it comes to
he's incapable.
When it comes to dismantling structures inside the federal government on DEI, I think that's a very good thing. I think a meritocracy is what ought to be preferred.
What about the economy? What about the quality of our lives in the context of what we deal with day in and day out? Just your typical family. What has Trump done that has significantly benefited us in the last year?
So this is where I'll go back to my fundamental.
Because I'm not getting that big tax cut.
This is where I'll go back to my sort of fundamental point, which is that I think that the government guaranteeing that your life is going to be enormously better based on what are at best marginal changes to the structure of the federal government, I think that's an overpromise. So I think that how are lives better? Well, I mean, inflation is obviously down. It was started to drop under the late Biden, and then it started to.
I just saw the numbers today. I mean, you saw food was up 8%. You saw groceries up 8%, and food was up 7%. I mean,
the overall CPI is running at about 2.6, 2.7%. That's way down from where it was 2 years ago.
Still not close to that too.
I agree.
Been kind of stuck where it was a year ago.
This is why I'm not in favor of, for example, lowering the interest rates. I think that the Federal Reserve
worst job market in 16 years. Manufacturing factory jobs down.
Yeah, tariffs have not helped the manufacturing. Again,
average person's paying more for Halloween. We paid a little more
than they were
Christmas.
they were last year on a margin, sort of on a low rate. I mean, I think that again,
get rid of those tariffs? That would be significant policy.
I've been a big advocate of getting rid of the tariffs since literally day one. The biggest issue that I see with the Trump administration on the economy is that the promise that Trump thought he was making is not the promise I think that actually came out rhetorically. So rhetorically, he was saying everything's going to become affordable again. And what people mean by affordable is I want 2019 prices.
Yeah.
Okay. No one is getting 2019 prices.
There's unless we get into a stagflation.
Until we get into a recession.
Exactly.
Exactly.
Yeah.
If we get into a recession,
No,
stagflation wouldn't do. You need actual stagnation, right? You need like an actual depression or a recession.
I stand corrected.
And so the sort that promise is not a coherent one. It's why I actually had some sympathy for when he said, affordability is nonsense. I think what he meant by that actually is that affordability. When have you ever thought, hey, everything's affordable? Right? Pretty rare in anyone's life to say things are just affordable.
Maybe at the dollar store.
Right. It's a comparative term.
Now it's $1.29 at the dollar store.
And so specifically speaking, I think it's good that inflation is down. I think it's good that the stock market is up. 50% of Americans hold stocks. And when the stock market is robust, that means there can be more investments in, for example, infrastructure projects and data centers and all the rest. I'm a believer that there is, in fact, a bubble that's going on in the stock market because there's an enormous amount of momentum at the top end. And most of the gains in the stock market are happening in
7
AI.
stocks. Yeah,
it doesn't mean
10.
that AI won't be an amazing thing. I think it is an amazing thing, but I do think that there will be a winnowing at the top end of the market. When that happens, then there will probably be a depression of some sort, not a great depression, but I mean like depressed prices in the markets. I think that a lot of these stocks are trading at unsustainable PE ratios. I'm concerned about all those things. The main critique I have for President Trump on the economic front is that investors, what they are really looking for is, number one, less regulation, ease of investment, but number two, consistency. And the lack of consistency at the federal level is incredibly difficult for investors to navigate. Yep. And actually, I think that if the Supreme Court steps in and says no to the tariffs, you'll actually see a rather large economic boost because of it, because the Supreme Court will have placed a limitation then on the executive branch that is fairly robust.
3/4 that he can oppose with other means, though. That's going to be when the IEP
but then the Supreme Court will likely step in at that point too.
6 months, a year later. That's the problem. The lag.
Again, I'm very critical of the tariff.
Yeah, no. I appreciate the consistency.
Yeah.
But on Trump generally, I'm curious.
On foreign policy, which you put it to the side, I think Trump has been the greatest foreign policy president in my lifetime. I don't think it's close. I think he's been spectacular on foreign policy, and that's with many of my critiques with regard to, for example, Ukraine, where I'm significantly more hawkish than the administration has been.
And did you feel that way in his first term?
Yes,
I felt the same way too.
Yes, I was very much an advocate of his foreign policy. I thought that in terms of his foreign policy, he is, as he said before, he has not got us into any major wars, which is a good thing.
We've used the military 6-7 significant times.
He has used the military in, I think, targeted and pinpointed ways that do not reinforce the Iraq War syndrome that we need to put hundreds of thousands of troops on the ground. I think the president has a very good feel for the thing about foreign policy is it kind of works like the New York real estate market. It actually is a sort of zero-sum win or lose game, and President Trump actually is quite good at those. And I think that on domestic economics, the president tends to bring a zero-sum approach sometimes to his economic issues that I don't agree with, because I think that you can expand the pie for everybody. But I don't think the same thing holds true generally in foreign policy, where when it comes to geopolitics, there's a winner and there's a loser, and it's all about relative power and power dynamics. And the president seems to get that on a very gut level, which is why in the Middle East, I think he did the right thing with Gaza. I think he's done the right thing with the Iran strike on Fordo nuclear facility. I think he did the right thing in extraditing Nicolas Maduro. I think those are all good things. I think that he has found ways to continue the funding of Ukraine via this sort of jerry-rigged NATO buying weapons and funding. I think that he has gotten a bunch of countries in Europe to increase their defense spending, which is something that even Mark Rutte over at NATO has said is generally a good thing. I think all of these things. I don't argue with that.
I mean, we can, if people are looking for us to unpack that, we can spend hours and hours on every single one of these specific examples. Let me ask you, and before we get off the foreign policy, I am curious, Greenland. Come on.
I don't understand why we are attempting to make Greenland our 51st state. It seems to me we already have defense agreements in
well
place.
Established since 1951. We were the ones that pulled back. We can re-enter any day of the week.
Listen, I think that Greenland. I think that despite the desire to rename it Trumpland, I think that
I haven't even heard that.
No,
I'm
but
just trying to deal with the Donnie doctrine or whatever it is.
I think that's silly. I think that the attempt to strengthen our bases in Greenland would be a good thing. But I think that's a
which
different thing.
Which he can do tomorrow, which they've already agreed to.
Agree.
And the whole thing seems folly, but it is.
Now invading Canada, that's it.
Okay, but I want to just, because you write about it in Lions and Scavengers, you talk about this notion of free enterprise, you talk about markets. What do you make of Trump's interventionist attitudes, not just overseas, but as it relates to corporations and companies? So many disproportionately based out here, including MP Materials, which is.
I don't think the federal government should be taking stakes in private companies. I don't believe in what has been called crony capitalism or state capitalism. Really, it's just corporatism. I'm not a fan of the idea that the government ought to be involved in command and control economics with regard to private companies. So I've opposed that pretty much every step of the way. I think it's a mistake. I think that the market has a magical ability to make things better and cheaper over time if left to its own devices.
And that includes, by the way, not interfering in the independence of the Fed?
Yes.
So
yes. Listen, I'm an
Powell's.
Austrian School of Economics guy. I think that there's a good case to be made that the Fed really should not have control over inflation rates in the first place. I think the target inflation rate should be 0, not 2. And I think that we should allow interest rates generally to free float because I think that sometimes one of the great problems with the American economy is artificial bubbles that are created by loose monetary policy. I think that's what helped lead to the Great Recession. And I think it's what also led to the inflationary spiral under Joe Biden.
What do you make of Donald Trump? And forgive me, this is, we're zigging and zagging around a little bit, but I still can't get over the fact that he sat down and had dinner with Nick Fuentes.
So I think that was a bad thing to do, obviously. I think that Nick Fuentes is a scumbag. I think that the president has, an unfortunate tendency to make nice with people who want to make nice with him. He did come out this week, by the way, and in the New York Times said the Republican Party wants nothing to do with people like Nick Fuentes, doesn't want to do with anti-Semites. I'll continue to be critical of Republicans who flirt with this sort of stuff. I wish that the Democratic Party were as critical of sitting Congress members who not only flirt with this sort of stuff, but overtly traffic in this sort of stuff. I'll ask you about Zohran Mamdani. Zohran Mamdani, literally in the campaign, he was asked on Fox News about Hamas, and he refused to denounce it as a terrorist group.
They are a terrorist group, and they should have been denounced. I was there, as you know, a few weeks after.
Yes.
October 7th, met with Bibi. Not a big fan of Bibi. This is where we have fundamental disagreements.
Fine,
quite the contrary, in fact.
But staying on domestic politics for a second.
Yeah.
It seems to have become a sort of de rigueur requirement for Democrats who are running for office to now suggest, for example, Scott Wiener just did this, he's running for Congress, that Israel committed a genocide in Gaza. That is, forget about anti-Semitism and discussions of it, because I think that those have become really loose and people don't have a consistent definition of anti-Semitism. Let's just talk about what's true.
That's true. I think it's true about the definition. I mean, we, as you know, have been struggling with that in California as it relates to a lot of laws and legislation.
Of course, anti-Semitism is a fundamentally different cat than, for example, racism. It's basically a conspiracy theory about Jewish power in the world.
And it makes me sick to my stomach, and I say that clearly. And but not just, of course. I mean, we've tried to lead in terms of our response, and we've called out and called balls and strikes in terms of the outrageous things that have happened.
So I would, in my own framework of anti-Semitism, I think that saying overtly false things about the Jewish state is a form of anti-Semitism, but I don't think that is really important as much as it is it true or not? So Democrats have now been dragged into this conversation, some dragged, some run with, flags waving, into the conversation
This notion of genocide.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, look,
Israel did not commit a genocide in Gaza. There is no standard by which Israel committed a genocide in Gaza, just on a factual level.
Just
as
a
this.
legal and factual level.
Yes.
Yeah.
What is your opinion of this?
My opinion is, I understand the tendency for people to make that, to assert that.
Why?
On the basis of the images and the proportionality.
Ugly shit doesn't mean genocide.
No. And by the way, I agree with you.
And international and proportionality doesn't mean that if you kill my child and I then kill 7 criminals, that I've been disproportionate.
I'm not disagreeing with you, but I think but I understand that tendency on the basis of trying to reconcile the proportionate nature of how the war was ultimately conducted and the devastation.
I have a question. Why do you feel the need to create a permission structure for that sort of stuff? I mean, meaning it's not true. Yeah. Why not just say it's not true?
Yeah, look, I don't know the definition, or I don't know the legal threshold. That's not my opinion, so I don't share that opinion as it relates to genocide. I do not agree with that notion.
But you do understand that if you accuse Israel of committing a genocide, that now puts Israel in the position of it should be a pariah state, because states that commit genocide should be pariah states. Yeah. So granting legitimacy to that position inherently,
I'm not granting legitimacy. I'm just saying the devastation in Gaza, at the human level. You've got 4 kids.
Of course, it's terrible.
No, but I think it's also important to absorb that a little bit more. Just as it was sick, and we were clear in our condemnation, these people like me, as it relates to what Hamas did in that act of barbarism and terrorism.
Yeah, but there's a difference between deliberate terrorism and wartime collateral damage, of course. And if we refuse to acknowledge that reality, then we end up equating
collateral damage. I have stronger opinions. It wasn't just collateral.
You think that Israel is targeting civilians?
I think some of the double tapping issues. I have a lot of issues with how Bibi ultimately conducted the war. I personally do, and I have a lot of issues that are also painted on the basis of the conversation I had with him a few weeks later after October 7th. The way he talked about the Palestinians, I kept talking about Hamas. He kept talking about the Palestinians. I kept coming back to Hamas, and then ultimately how the war was conducted. Not saying it was a genocide. I'm not. But I have issues.
What is the thing that he said that you particularly?
There was a dehumanization. I didn't like the way he talked about the Palestinian people. I just didn't.
What is the specific?
They can't govern. I didn't. The specific. I don't want to get into the details. The
reason I'm asking is because when you suggest that he is conflating Hamas and the Palestinians,
he wasn't conflating.
And of course, it does lead to the conclusion.
They were different. It wasn't. No. It was. I'm just saying the way he ultimately conducted it. I look back at that conversation. I reflect on that conversation. It doesn't surprise me, and I did not think it was proportionate.
Okay,
and I thought it was overwhelming, and the devastation and destruction breaks my heart.
Okay, so you're president of the United States. Somebody invades from Mexico. They take several thousand American citizens.
I get it.
By the
way,
they hold them all the way until the end of the war. Until the end of the war, their hostages being held.
Don't get me wrong on any of this. I'm with you in terms of the ultimate accountability and bringing the hostages home. I like the clarity and conviction as it relates to getting all the hostages dead and alive home, and all of that. I'm not denying that.
And by the way, Hamas still has not been extirpated in the areas where Israel has left them alone.
And clearly this truce. And détente is still a work in progress. There's been a lot of destruction.
Well, because Hamas was supposed to be disarmed, and they didn't.
I'm crystal clear about Hamas.
But the point is that
crystal clear about Hamas.
Right, but the point is that I think,
and I'm also crystal clear in my love for Israel and my condemnation of Bibi. And there's a distinction. I condemn Donald Trump. I love my country, and I think that should be easy.
Listen, anyone is free to disagree with Prime Minister Netanyahu anytime that they want. I will point out that,
but they're not anti-Semitic when they say.
Of course not.
But that's also important to say, because some people conflate that. You don't.
No, of course.
But others do.
I've critiqued Bibi myself, mainly for not being right wing enough, in my opinion, on many issues domestically. Actually, but when it comes to, when it comes to I mean, we can get into perceptions of Netanyahu's leadership and all this. I will say this. I know every major politician in Israel, just I know many major politicians in Ukraine, in Hungary, in a wide variety of places. In Israel, I happen to know the last several prime ministers. If anyone outside of the state of Israel believes that Naftali Bennett or Yair Lapid, who's on the left,
would have conducted their response,
that is nuts. Yeah. That's nuts. It's not true.
No, fair point. And look, hey,
and the IDF, by the way, operates largely independently in some ways of the prime minister's office. It's kind of a strange dual system that they have over there. I know too many soldiers who, I talk about one in the book who had 3 limbs blown off going door to door in Gaza, not using not using overwhelming air power to eviscerate millions of people.
I was in the hospital meeting victims on October 7th in Israel. So I been to memorials and
I want to be clear in the terminology we use about all this stuff, because right now, for example,
but the genocide
where are the members of the Democratic Party protesting and wearing pins for the protesters in Iran who are getting mowed down, maybe by the tens of thousands this week?
Well, I know where I am. I put out a pretty clear statement this week, and
I'd like to see more Democrats.
Yeah, I don't disagree with you. And by the way, I also thought it was the right thing to do, that strike, and I thought it was unbelievably effective and efficient, and had no problem saying that during the strike. Didn't wait for the outcome. So I marched to a beat of a little bit of a different drum, a little bit more nuance here. But there is, everything's so black and white. There's nuance here. I mean,
for sure. But I think that the point that I'm making, to get back to sort of where we originally departed here, was that, I'm trying to call out what I see as bad behavior, untrue, immoral behavior on my own side. I'd like to see that more from a Democratic Party that seemed to be perfectly willing to wrap an arm around Zohran Mamdani the minute he got a little bit of momentum. The same man who had said that whenever the NYPD boot is on the throat of Americans, the IDF is lacing the boot. That sort of nonsense is terrible.
No, I don't associate with those comments at all. I mean, and look, he doesn't speak for me.
Should Mamdani be the mayor of New York?
That's up for people in New York to make that decision. That's not for me to be out here in California, thousands of miles away.
You don't believe President Trump should be president? The American people decided he should.
Well, that directly impacts me. I mean, New York may indirectly, but I mean, it's a little bit of a different question. We'll see how he ultimately does. I thought he ran an incredibly effective campaign. I think there's a lot of interesting attributes that he has. Incredibly bright, incredibly capable. He's delivered some
there are a lot of terrible people who say bright and capable things.
No, I get it. But and I absolutely disagree with him on a lot of those comments. And I also maintained that posture pretty consistently over a long period of time. And no, I was not a Cuomo fan. So just for the record, and sorry.
As it turns out, there weren't a lot of Cuomo fans.
And I say this with respect. I mean, the Cuomo family is a good Democrat, his father, and there's some members of the family I like a lot. But look, these are tougher issues, and they are tough issues. And I appreciate your willingness to call balls and strikes. And a lot of folks, frankly, a lot of folks in your world, as we sort of castigate the right-wing media ecosystem, your willingness to call this stuff out. And
I think that in general, this is the way, if we want to have a way forward in American politics, just to get a little general here, it has to be predicated on certain basic premises about truth. And that's why I keep saying, forget about, categorization. Is it true or is it not true? I think one of the major failings of the Democratic Party in the last election cycle is the unwillingness to say whether it was true or untrue that a boy could become a girl, for example. I think a lot of people looked at that and they said, excuse me? How is this? Forget about the political ramifications or the policy ramifications for just a second. Can you say a boy is not a girl? And boys cannot just become girls.
And I don't. We can go down. I mean, I feel like a year ago I was with Charlie having this conversation, which is remarkable. I'm curious. Did you? And I'm. This is not. I'm just honestly curious when I'm asking this. I'm not even. It's not. There's not a loaded question. Did you or others in the right condemn the Trump policies as it relates to gender-affirming care for including reassignment surgeries in the federal prison system under the Trump administration's first term?
I mean, if I'd been aware of them, I would have condemned them. My company was the only company in America, I believe, that on a media level refused to use preferred pronouns for anyone. We use only biological pronouns since 2015, since we launched the company.
No, and I say that because it's just not well known, but the Trump administration's policies allowed for gender assignment, gender affirming care, but hormone treatment, being an actual.
I think that's
changed. The operations.
I mean,
it was federal policy.
Listen, I think that's wrong, and I wish that, frankly, you would go further. You've talked about the unfairness in sports, but to me, the bigger question is not unfairness in sports. The bigger question is whether we should be allowing the administration of chemical or surgical mutilation of minors based on gender dysphoria.
Well, the Trump administration has strong opinions. They've sued states like California, many other states, 20 plus states.
So, yes.
And my position is that's between the physician, it's between the family member, and these patients themselves.
Why? Are there any surgical or chemical interventions that you would oppose, even if the patient and doctor want?
Here we go. I mean, I know exactly where this debate goes.
Right, but I'm asking. I mean, it's a real question because it does have public policy implications. Meaning, in the state of California, there's a judicial ruling. We referenced it earlier. That said,
well, that judicial ruling was ridiculous on this basis. Any teacher, And what you're talking about is a law that I signed as it relates to this idea that
school districts
you can
mandating
fire
the teachers.
that you can fire someone for not telling on a child and saying that they're talking about being gay, not just trans issues, any LGBTQ issues, that you can be fired. There's nothing in the law. The law that I signed does not preclude these teachers from telling the parents.
No, it precludes school districts from
mandating and firing someone for not. But it allows the teacher to make that judgment on the basis of seeing someone that's being bullied and the requirements they have under the law to keep people safe.
As a parent, don't you believe that a teacher should facilitate the passage of information to you? Why would that?
On every basis? I mean, that they should somehow just be listening.
The teacher's going to call you. I mean, if my kid decides to come out as trans
it's about
at school,
safety. The law is pretty clear, and and the teachers have that ability, and the teachers maintain that ability. We didn't deny that. We didn't say to the teachers, "You cannot."
No,
quite the contrary. This is critical because there's been a lot of misinformation about this.
I'm not misinterpreting the law. I mean, what the law did is it prohibited school districts.
You shouldn't fire someone. And in many cases, look, anyone that's members of the LGBTQ community, how many stories that you've heard of people that say, I went to my parents with my teacher. That was a safe place for me in school. There's a lot of grace in this space. There's a lot of testimony in this space that I think should just provide a little bit of grace and humility. It's not a black and white issue. Teachers can still, quote unquote, turn in a child. They just can't be fired.
I mean, but my question on that, and again, this is a subset of a broader issue, is why does the parent not have an absolute moral ability to receive that information? And why is there not a requirement? There should be a requirement for teachers to turn over that information.
Health and safety is a requirement.
If a teacher truly believes that a parent is a threat to a child, they can report it to child services.
Yeah, so health and safety is still the standard. So you maintain that standard. That standard is the law.
That's a lot of wiggle room for a teacher to apply.
Well, it's a lot of law in terms of the weight of that law and the responsibility to take care of it, make sure your kids are safe. But this idea that Trump says people are going to public schools and coming back, having surgeries and coming back the next day is absurd.
No, but there are certainly cases in which kids are being, quote unquote, socially transitioned at school without parents knowing about it. I know some of the parents to whom this has happened. I mean, this is the fundamental question that lies at the root of all of this is the question that you're not wanting to answer, which is whether boys can become girls.
Yeah, I think for the grace of God. Yeah.
I mean, I appreciate the sympathy. I also feel terrible for anybody who's suffering with any sort of
I think it's been the case for terrible, generations, for time immemorial. God bless. I don't know how.
Why is this a hard one? I just don't understand.
Because I don't know why it's such a. Why is it such a? I'm curious. I understand the political potency of it.
It's not just politically potent,
but it's just how. It's so few. We're talking about so few people.
It's not about
that are struggling with gender identity issues. A lot of remarkable people, a lot of wildly successful people, and they've gone on their life, have incredible lives. I don't know. There's so much hate and bigotry, so much condemnation, so much judgment.
This is the part where I start to object. Yeah. Okay. The idea that
you may not be spewing it.
No.
Like some others. Trust me.
But
this is the business they're in.
There are lots of terrible people who say lots of terrible things. But
yes.
It is not an act of bigotry to say that a boy cannot become a girl, nor should my children be taught in K through 12 public schools that a boy can become a girl.
Yeah.
That is not an act of bigotry. That's an act of rationality and biological simplicity.
I respect your point of view. And,
but does the state?
Good people disagree on this.
I know, but
and a lot of states, not just California, well-established rules, by the way, that predate me. Again, this is not where I started. We're campaigning and advocating on these issues, as some suggest. Look, I'm with the Governor Spencer Cox, who said about many of these issues, never so much attention been placed on so few people.
The problem is, I do think that on an electoral level, to go to the politics, it is a barrier to entry for a lot of people. When
I agree with that.
When you say a boy can become a girl. And then just on a realistic...
And by the way, I respect if that's your barrier to then listening to people on a myriad of other issues, so be it. It is what it is.
I find it strange that even if you wish to have a public policy that pursues something different, we cannot just admit that boys and girls are two different things and that a boy cannot become a girl. Why is this so difficult?
Yeah. I understand your point of view.
I appreciate
and I also respect Caitlyn Jenner. I do.
It's not about respect for individuals.
Well, no,
I mean, I can tell you a story. This is there was a situation in which,
by the way,
I was speaking at University of
this
British
is a harder
Columbia.
thing for me too. As you may know, and you probably do. I have a trans godson. There's a little more. I find the humanity. I find different aspects of this, different layers.
This goes back to my sort of truth.
But I know you're facts over empathy.
Well, I mean, I'll
get
give you, here's the story. So I was speaking at University of British Columbia. This must have been now 5 years ago or so.
Yep.
And a person who identified as trans got up at the microphone. And obviously I do a lot of these things on campus. I used to do more of them. And this issue came up. The person started talking about his family's biological male. Again, you can use whatever pronouns you choose to use. It's a free country. Yeah. But you can't force me to use pronouns that I believe are grammatically incorrect. Anyway,
by the way, I'm not sitting here, trying to browbeat you on pronouns.
I'm just putting that out there. So anyway, so this person gets up and starts talking about his family and how they treat him. And I said, I'd really appreciate if we're going to have a conversation on sort of a general and philosophical level about this issue, if you didn't invoke your family, because I don't want to be in a position of having to talk to you about what your family thinks or believes. And the person continued to invoke their family, said, well, my family keeps saying that I am a woman, that I'm a woman. And finally, after about 7-8 minutes of this, I said, listen, you've now forced me to the corner where I have to give my opinion. My opinion is that your family is treating you with sympathy, but they don't actually believe that you're a woman, because they care about you and they love you, but they will fib to you because they believe that it is better for you or that you will not hurt yourself if you say this thing that is not true. The person got very upset, rushed out of the room. Now, normally that's the kind of thing that ends up online as a, destroys video kind of thing. I went to the people who were in charge of the event. I had them cut it from the tape because I was worried about the person's mental health status.
I appreciate that.
I called up a person who I knew the person because they'd mentioned it to me. And I actually had breakfast with the person the next morning to make sure that he was okay.
Good for you.
So my only point here is not what a wonderful person I am. It's that sympathy does not preclude truth telling. And when you're making public policy, it is very important that sympathy not preclude truth telling. Yeah. And I think that, again, it's not just the trans issue. If the idea is that I have to protect my friends and I have to attack my enemies in politics, things get really squirrely really quickly. Because, again, public policy is for everyone. It is not just for subgroups.
Yeah. I hear you. We just see the world with a different set of eyes on this. I appreciate your sort of intellectual argument and the sort of soundness and the firmness in that space. I can't help but unpack the relationship to families and people and lives lived and the grace and people's lives that are lost and people that are struggling and going through this. I just that's how and to me that does shape the way I make policy, because it's not just science, it's art, it's lived experience, it's reality, and it goes back to the sanctuary thing. There's certain lived realities, and one has to sort of deal with the cards that are dealt, as imperfect as things are and life is.
And as you know, no.
But you're one of these. That's why you got the 180 IQ. What was it?
No, I do not have 180 IQ.
Skipping,
it's high, but it ain't 180. Yeah.
Jesus, I mean, you can read your book to learn more. By the way, when I was listening, reading Lions and Scavengers, this notion of victimization and envy, the scavenger mindset. Yes. I thought you were writing about Donald Trump.
Well, listen, when I was on with Ezra said, it feels like you're talking about a lot of people on both sides. And I said, that is true. I am talking about a lot of people on both sides. I think that, one of the points I make in the book, is that the model of Lions and Scavengers is really about kind of people who build versus people who wish to destroy. And the point that I make is that's actually an internal battle inside of all of us. If you go back to the book of Genesis and the story of Cain and Abel, it's a fascinating story, obviously, for a variety of reasons, which is why it's lasted for several thousand years. But what happens is that Cain actually initiates the idea of let's give sacrifices to God. And then God takes Abel's sacrifice, but not Cain's. And it doesn't say in the Bible why that is. That's just what happens. And Cain gets angry. And God actually goes to Cain and he says, listen, you have the ability to fix yourself, right? Sin crouches at your door. But, and the word in Hebrew is timshal, you can overcome that. You have the capacity to overcome that. And so in every human heart is the capacity to be the person who builds, makes things stronger, makes if you're a politician, better policy, makes the country stronger in terms of its social fabric, or the person who's going to grift, or the person who's going to engage in conspiracy theories, or the person who's going to tear things down because they're unhappy with their life and therefore have decided, falsely, with no evidence, that the system is to blame for all of that. I see politicians who do both of those things. I think that sometimes I look at what President Trump says and I think, that's a real lion thing to do. I think that sending the sending the B-2s to Fordo was a lying thing to do. I think that grabbing Maduro was a lying thing. And then sometimes he says things, and I'm like, that is a scavenger thing to do. So, this week, for example, he's doing some populist things on economics that probably some members of the left would agree with.
Like
I disagree with
10% caps on credit cards?
I think that's silly. I think that is again, externalizing people's debt problem to a place that does not solve the problem, and in fact is more likely to lead to people not being able to get credit cards, because obviously if you
sound like the head of JP Morgan. What about rolling up all the corporate purchases of private single family homes?
I think that is a ridiculous misdirect. Okay, the fact is that in the state of California, for example, exorbitantly low percentage of
relative to other states.
Relative to other states for sure.
Yeah.
Okay, and guess what? Real estate here, really, really expensive. And meanwhile, if you go over to Charlotte, North Carolina, where the real estate prices actually have been diving, you actually do have pretty significant corporate ownership. And here we're talking about large corporations, not like small mom and pop operations where you own a second home to rent it out. Typically speaking, when a corporation invests in an area like, say, Phoenix, and then builds up an enormous number of rental units, because that's what happens. They buy, let's say, a single family home, now they rent it out. Okay, so they just increased the stock of rent, right? Which means that the rental prices go down.
Yep.
And then corporations typically are investing in areas where it's easier to buy and easier to renovate and easier to build. Like renovating is very difficult in places like New York and in certain parts of California. It's a lot easier in, say, Austin or Phoenix or Florida. And so what you've seen is actually there is not only zero correlation between corporate ownership of real estate assets and price of rent, for example. In many cases, there's a reverse correlation. And so trying to refocus on, look at this terrible, it isn't BlackRock. BlackRock doesn't own real estate assets in this fashion. But if you're looking at Blackstone, right? And then it's Blackstone's fault that the real estate prices are going up. No, it isn't. And again, I think that
so why is he pursuing two policies that you vehemently disagree with?
Because I think that it is
flailing on the issue of the economy with the American people.
Governor, I think that it is politically beneficial for politicians to tell people that their problems are easily solvable with the stroke of a pen and by blaming somebody who's richer than they are. I think that is a very easy way to get away with really bad public policy.
All right, let's talk about it. We're on limited time here, Ben. My gosh, we've covered so much. And I know everyone's like,
that's been fun.
Wait, why haven't we gotten into politics in Nigeria, or we can talk about Somaliland, and we can get into some more interesting, nuanced issues. And, we didn't even get to Xi, and there is legitimately a lot of issues that I think are fascinating, that will define more things in more ways on more days. But what do you make of, Republicans have no chance in this midterm, right?
I think that they are in for a world of hurt right now in the midterms. I mean, they're the incumbent party. They have a bare majority.
Yeah.
That alone would put them behind the 8 ball. There are not a lot of swing districts that are kind of left because of all the redistricting. But the swing districts that are left seem to be trending more blue. President Trump isn't on the ballot, so he doesn't really have coattails among the low propensity electorate. So yeah, I think that Republicans are gonna have a rough ride.
On the scale 1 to 10, how big a mistake was not expanding the healthcare subsidies or extending them?
So I have made the case that on just a raw political level, and again,
right.
I will say that what I do is different than what you do, right? I mean, like you're in the podcast space now, so this is my ball game. But the reality is that you're in the policymaking space, and I've said this to Republican and Democratic politicians.
That's why I have to bring the human element into this, Ben. The human element.
See, this is where I would say you need to remove the human element, Governor. But I would say that one of the things that I hope that people appreciate about the difference is that in the podcast space, you can be a purist, and in the political space, you try to get 70% of the pie. And so when you are looking at, for example, extending the Obamacare subsidies, it is a political loser, obviously, for Republicans not to extend the Obamacare subsidies and to let it hit a cliff, clearly. Then the question becomes, what can you do that shortens the duration? If you're a conservative, if you're a Republican, what can you do that creates a softer landing for people who are reliant on those subsidies and a transition to policies that you believe will, in general, bend the cost curve down in the meantime? Because if you have kind of a hard stop, then that's going to affect a lot of people. There's a reason why purple state Republicans, purple district Republicans are trying to cut deals right now with Democrats in order to extend those healthcare subsidies. Hopefully, in return, they will get some provisions on fraud, maybe some release of certain regulations around Obamacare. I think the healthcare system is so complex. It's so mixed. It's let's put it this way. If you and I were sitting and designing a healthcare system and there was none, then I think that we might have very differing ideas of where it goes.
Yep.
But trying to extricate ourselves from what is an incredibly difficult situation, I think that the easiest and dumbest way to do policy is to just keep tossing money at it. But I also think that on a political level, if you never have the power to do better things, then you never have the power to do the better things. You got to get as much of the pie as you can, and that's the nature of pragmatism, as you are constantly talking about.
Well said. I agree, brother. Your sentiment. It's interesting. We on the issue of subsidy, it's an important point. I mean, we'd have to lower the cost of healthcare. It's why I'm very proud of California. We created our own insulin branded drug under CalRx. We're just lowering costs, not subsidizing costs, which means socializing that cost on the rest of the rate payers more broadly, or premium payers. But on the issue of Vance and Rubio, Vance or Rubio, Ben?
I mean, in terms of who
2028, what's going to happen?
So I think that, look, J.D. Vance has already, sort of been deemed by Marco Rubio as the presumptive nominee, barring some sort of cataclysmic circumstance. In terms of who I tend to agree with more politically, obviously, I would think that the Secretary of State Rubio on foreign policy, I tend to be more aligned with. Yeah, I think that the vice president, obviously a very high IQ guy. There are certain areas of policy I agree with him on. There are certain areas of policy I strenuously disagree with the vice president. Right now, if you have to lay odds, then JD is the most likely nominee. Things can change. Obviously, it's very early.
Who leaves first, Hexit or Pam Bondi?
Again, in terms of, this is where you get into sort of the personality side of the business that I care less about. But I think that it is significantly more likely that Pam Bondi's out before the Secretary of Defense.
Interesting. Thanks for coming all the way out.
Hey, thank you. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it. This has been fun.
Ben Shapiro, you're always welcome back home.
Hey, thanks so much.